think we've had enough time to let everybody in. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this Metropolitan Study Group. I'd just like to take this moment to say that there are indeed many of us here who have dialed in from all around the world, which is absolutely wonderful. Now that we're coming towards the end of this year for the Metropolitan Study Group, I'd like to say it's been a really wonderful year. It's been a very year full of enthusiasm and interest and lively discussion, interesting presentations, which leads me on to the fact that we have a very interesting paper this afternoon by Frater Travis, who is currently, he's presenting from Melbourne in Australia, and I think there's a large Melbourne contingent on the call this afternoon, and I think we're playing the equivalent of Rosicrucian cricket, and they've got more Fraters on this call than we have. So so without further ado, I would just like us to just take a little moment to sort of center ourselves, to think about the connection that we all have at this moment, so our Rosicrucian cord of light encircling the globe. It's brought us here today, and let us hope that we have a wonderful afternoon of interesting discourse and discussion, and may we leave with full hearts. So without further ado, Frater Travis, would you please like to introduce yourself? I've allowed you, if you need to share anything, you should be able to share. And yes, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction there, Alex. Now, let me just get myself sorted here. All righty, can everybody see the main slide there?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I'm Frater Travis Trinca, St. Christopher College here in Melbourne. And thank you for extending the opportunity to allow me to discuss perhaps what I think is perhaps the most interesting subject in all of esoterica. Now, it's about 20 to 1 here in Melbourne, so if I start to yawn, that's probably why. I've got a little bit of coffee to get me through, so I should be okay. Thank you to Frater Stephen and Frater Sheen for agreeing to move this plot forward a little bit. It looks like it was a bit of a success as well, so we've got a few other Melburnians here as well. Now, a couple of years ago, I was asked by the Victorian Lodge of Research to present a paper on Rosicrucianism. I think this paper's already been circulated and added to the Facebook event as well. This presentation will loosely follow that paper. Earlier this year, the Grand Lodge of Victoria hosted a convention, and we invited Frater Martin Fox to speak, and I had the opportunity to chat with Frater Martin about this talk while he was here in Melbourne. And I had told him that I plan to modify this presentation for the SRIA, assuming that they already have a bit of a foundation understanding of Rosicrucianism. However, Frater Martin did suggest that maybe I don't modify it too much, as a refresher on the subject is occasionally justified. So I've decided to try and strike a balance between providing an academic overview on one hand, whilst on the other hand, providing hopefully some fresh new context or a fresh new take of appreciating the Rosicrucian tradition. It's my sincere hope that everybody leaves this presentation having learned at least one new thing. Now, last month, Frater Robert Gordon gave a delightful presentation on Rosicrucianism in the 21st century. And if you haven't watched this out, you should check it out. It's on the SRIA London YouTube channel. And I think Frater Robert hit the mark on many points about Rosicrucianism being a living tradition. You know, Rosicrucianism today is a product of all that has come before it, and it is still continuing to evolve as well. Now, of necessity, I will be covering a lot of historical information today, but keep in mind that it is a living tradition. However, occasionally, a bit of a historical background is required to appreciate the direction and the purpose and the aims of a tradition, and this is especially the case with Rosicrucianism. So with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. The history, philosophy, and movement calling itself Rosicrucian is not very well known, even amongst students of established Rosicrucian groups. and yet its impact upon the sciences, arts, philosophy has been quite profound. In fact, many scholars attribute the foundation of Freemasonry itself to the pursuits of Rosicrucian philosophy. The term Rosicrucian was made popular in Germany in the early 1600s when a mysterious brotherhood calling themselves the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross made their first public appearance via a series of anonymous manifestos. In these, they professed to be healers, teachers, alchemists. They claimed to speak multiple languages, and they claimed to be in possession of secrets which had been hidden away from man, and their messages alluded to an ancient past and a universal wisdom. These curious announcements proved highly attractive to the learned of Europe, particularly those with an interest in Hermeticism, magic, Kabbalah, and especially alchemy. In the centuries that followed, we have various fraternal societies springing up across the globe dedicated to studying this Rosicrucian philosophy as initially set out in these writings. However, despite the large impact of this movement, Rosicrucian history and philosophy is still often poorly understood. The symbolic nature of the early Rosicrucian texts lends themselves to erroneous interpretation. Moreover, the occult revival period in Britain and France at the turn of the 20th century was proving advantageous of bringing together different traditions like alchemy and tarot and Kabbalah and lining up their correspondences. Unfortunately, this did prove a disservice to Rosicrucian philosophy by conflating it with other traditions. And as a result, the core identity of Rosicrucianism is often challenging to seek out. So as a result of that, we're going to go back to the source. We're going to head back to the source of the Rosicrucian mystery, the manifestos and the initial writings. I'll be taking a lot of quotations from these writings to enforce a point that I'm going to try and propose about who the Rosicrucians are. We'll start by looking at the manifestos themselves, a bit of a summary and overview of what they said. Then we'll have a look at the social and political landscape of the time. And what we'll find is that it was really the landscape that helped to amplify this message. And then we'll speculate a little bit as to authorship. We'll then have a look at Rosicrucian groups. And I don't mean looking at specific Rosicrucian groups. I mean, what are Rosicrucian groups trying to achieve? There's dozens of Rosicrucian groups out there in the world. What are they doing? What are they trying to achieve? What are their aims? Or what should they be doing? And hopefully by the end, we should be able to answer this question, who are the Rosicrucians? And I think what we'll find is it's not really a straightforward question to answer. So let's start off with the manifestos, usually considered to be a trilogy with the Fama Fraternitas in 1614, all printed in Germany. 1615, we have the Confessio Fraternitatis, and in 1616, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. Now, there are some that will say that it's not a trilogy, that maybe there's only two manifestos. They might exclude the chemical wedding because it is quite a different text. Some people might say there's 4, 5, or 6 manifestos, depending, if they add in various companion texts or texts that came in at the time. But for simplicity's sake, for this talk, we'll just look at it as a trilogy. Now, I said the Fama was printed in 1614, but as you can see on the right-hand side there were handwritten copies circulating as early as 1610. So what did the Fama have to say? Well, it describes the life, travels, and tomb of a poor monk of noble birth named Christian Rosenkreuz. This is the opening paragraph within the Fama, and it's already something curious has come up. Poor monk of noble birth. Yes, technically it is possible to be of nobility and to be poor, but generally those two things don't go hand in hand. Normally nobility is usually associated with the upper class. So there's something curious happening here already. In many ways, this is like us. We're of a noble heritage, a noble source. We have something divine within us, but we're poor because we're seemingly separated from that. In the Fama, we learn about Christian Rosenkreuz's family, his childhood, his studies. We learn a lot about his travels, and he travels to the east, gets some knowledge and wisdom, and takes it back to the west. He founds the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross with its governing rules, and the Fama ends with an elaborate description of his tomb. Now, there are some that are of the opinion that the Fama doesn't discuss Christian Rosenkreuz. It might discuss somebody known as Frater CR. Certainly, the Fama doesn't use the name Christian Rosenkreuz in the original German prints. However, personally, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that the person in the manifesto is in fact Christian Rosenkreuz. Maybe afterwards in the discussion, if anybody wants to discuss this as a sidebar, we could. It's a very interesting subject on its own. But again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use the term Christian Rosenkreuz. During his travels, he stayed in 7 major locations. He starts off in an unknown monastery somewhere in Germany. He journeys with his companion Pal to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where unfortunately his companion passes away, so they're stopped in Cyprus. Undeterred, he wants to continue on. He heads into Damascus, where he's detained himself from his own illness, where it says that his expertise in medicine won him favor with the Turks. And whilst here, he heard about the wise men of Damar and how nature was an open book to them. This inspired him so much that no longer was Jerusalem at the forefront of his mind. Now he wanted to travel to Damar. He wanted to find these wise men. And find them he did when he was 16 years old. And it was said that the wise men here had long expected him. They knew his name. They even entrusted to him their book of knowledge known as the Book M, which he translated into Latin and took it back with him on his roundabout journey back to Germany. Now, there's some people that may have heard of Damar being called Damkar. In the original English translations, the so-called Vaughan translations, it was known as Damkar. However, the Confessio references the place as Damar. The original German prints have Damar, and Damar was a real place. It was in Yemen. It was known for its university, so it's likely it was Damar. His next stop was in Egypt, where he only stays for a short time and studies the plants and animals before continuing on to Fez in Morocco, where it said the people here excelled in magic and Kabbalah, although their magic wasn't pure and their Kabbalah was tainted by their religion. It also says that he made acquaintance with the elementary inhabitants. Now, from the elementary inhabitants, we can observe a Paracelsian influence, and whilst the manifesto does not specify, it's probable that these inhabitants were the same creatures referenced by Paracelsus, the gnomes, the water undines, the air sylphs and salamanders. His next stop is back to Europe in Spain. He takes all of these treasures, all of this information that he's had, and takes it back to Europe to try and instruct the learned there. And the learned there, they agree that what he has to say is quite wise. They even admit that their own knowledge is lacking, but they're too invested in the status quo to receive his altruistic offers of information. And as a result, he gets a little bit depressed, a little bit down in the dumps. You could probably consider this to be the sort of Dark Knight equivalent of the story. He then heads back to Germany, builds a fit and neat habitation for reflection, writes a memoir, and builds some scientific instruments, and of course, founds the Fraternity of the Rosicrucians. So he gathers some disciples around himself, build their meeting place, the House Sancti Spiritus, and they have 6 governing rules: that they shouldn't profess to do anything but to cure the sick, and that they do that for free; that they shouldn't feel constrained to wear any particular mode of dress, but adopt the customs of the country in which they reside; that they meet once a year on the day C; that every brother should seek a worthy person to succeed him after his death, and keep that point in mind; that the word CR should be their seal, mark, and character, and that the fraternity should remain secret for 100 years. So we have generations of disciples. That's the first generation. They initiate their own successor, and then we get the second generation, so on. By the time we get to about the third generation, we have a brother known as NN who's doing some alterations on the House Sancti Spiritus when he wants to remove a bronze plaque which is fastened down with a strong nail. And he uses a bit of force and unwittingly removes a large chunk of masonry along with it, which exposes a hidden door with the words, "After 120 years, I shall open." Now, if we use the date of death of Christian Rosenkreuz from the Confessio, we get the year 1604 when this was opened, which interestingly is also the date the Neometria of Simon's Studium was printed. After this, we get a very elaborate description of the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz. The description of the tomb is vague enough that authors have managed to come up with all sorts of conclusions, but it's detailed enough to confirm that we're dealing with an allegorical space. Some people have called this an initiatory chamber. Some people have called it a metaphor for spiritual rebirth. There's no doubt, however, it is representing the microcosm, like the microcosm of the universe. I'm not going to go into a deep analysis of the tomb, but I just want to point out some features that support my position about who the Rosicrucians are, or at least what they represented during the manifesto period. The tomb was separated into three sections: an upper, a middle, and a lower. Of the upper, of the ceiling, it says, quote, "Of the ceiling you will not hear anything more from us at present, save that it was divided by triangles, running from the bright centre toward the seven sides. But what was inside could rather be seen by your own eyes, rather than be received by our description." End quote. Pretty fitting, sounds like a spiritual allegory. Of course, it can't be described. It's something that's ineffable, something beyond the description of words, maybe something that can only be conceived of in the heart. The visual description does also sound quite similar to some of the elaborate images created by Robert Flood, and we'll have a lot more to say about him sooner. Regarding the middle section of the walls, they contained various scientific instruments, all used to penetrate the natural world and better understand nature and the universe. In some of the elaborate hermetic images by Robert Flood, you also find scientific instruments and things being placed in the middle, somewhere between the worldly and the divine spheres as well. So some similarities there. From this, we can consider that the devices in the walls to be speculative rather than operative devices, to borrow some Masonic language: the mirrors for reflection, the lamps for directing knowledge, etc. The manifesto also states that should the Brotherhood ever perish, all of their secrets can be reconstituted from this tomb alone. Again, further reinforcing the idea that this is the microcosm of the universe. Similar to how you can look at the first degree tracing board in the lodge room, and you'd say that's the microcosm of the lodge room or the microcosm of the universe. You should consider the tomb to be in the same vein. Now, the details of the tomb aren't as specific as what's in this image here. The artist has taken some creative liberties, but the dimensions and proportions are roughly similar. The next manifesto is the Confessio Fraternitatis, and the poor Confessio, I think, suffers from middle child syndrome. It doesn't have the Indiana Jones treasure hunting feel of the Fama, and it doesn't have all the alchemical symbolism of the chemical wedding. From my perspective, though, I think it's probably the best of all three. It's a very amazing text, especially if you do read it as a spiritual allegory. It describes Germany as suffering from a philosophical sickness. But the Rosicrucians, they've got a cure. They say that a new age has begun. It was now time to share the genuine Rosicrucian secrets, but only to the worthy. They describe a coming return to Adamic or a true Christian wisdom, and they urge the reader to study both the Bible and study nature, both essential for revealing the word. They offer 37 reasons in this manifesto for the existence of the fraternity of the Rosy Cross, and it offers many descriptions of how we can meet the fraternity. One of the ways it describes how we can meet the fraternity is by saying, only those who are sincere and chosen by God will find us. Another way it describes how we may meet the fraternity is by saying, do not disturb our sacred silence with your clamour if you merely want to satisfy your curiosity, enticed by the gleam of gold. Although we could instruct and educate the whole world and free it from endless troubles, we're not made known to anyone unless God permits it. It is impossible for anyone to enjoy our benefits against God's will. He will sooner lose his life in searching for us than attain felicity by finding us. Now, superficially, we could consider that this meeting with the Rosicrucians akin to meeting some superheroes, the Avengers, existing in a town, or Order of the Phoenix if we're considering Harry Potter, but let's be a bit more philosophical, a bit more nuanced. It sounds like a meeting with the fraternity of the Rosy Cross is really akin to meeting with something divine in ourselves. The communion with the soul, maybe, or simply knowing thyself. The next manifesto is a chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. A very, very different text to the previous two. Now, once the Fama, the one where Christian Rosenkreuz travels to the east and gets the book M and comes back and has the 6 governing rules, is no doubt an allegory. We don't have any historical or archaeological evidence to suggest that this person existed. Yes, maybe it's loosely based on a person. It's not unusual for scholarly people at the time, particularly those in medical practice, to travel to learn things and come back. It could be based on somebody, but there's no evidence there to say that he existed. But it's written as if it is a real story. Likewise, the Confessio is an allegory, but it's written as if it really is the modus operandi of the fraternity. The Chemical Wedding doesn't pretend. It doesn't pretend to be a non-fiction. It is a fantasy story through and through. It takes place over 7 days. It starts off with an elderly man, Christian Rosenkreuz, about to eat his Easter brekkie one morning when he's interrupted by a loud, uninvited guest, an angel, coming down from the heavens and handing to him an invitation to attend a royal wedding in a faraway land. The next 7 days describes his journey to that castle and all the things that take place on his way through with a lot of alchemical symbolism. The climax of the story has the nobles and royals dismembered and body parts placed into chests, so it sounds very much like typical medieval alchemy, where all these chests are taken to the Tower of Olympus, where they undergo various alchemical operations, rarefying as they ascend up the 7 levels of the Tower of Olympus, where finally at the top we have reborn the Red King and the White Queen, sort of divine incarnate, perfect beings. On the right-hand side, we can see a funny little symbol. That's the invitation that Christian Rosenkreuz received, and that was designed first by John Dee in his work, the Monas Hieroglyphica, which he considered to be his most important work. So it does show there was an influence from Dee's work on the author or authors of the manifestos. Dee was well and truly gone by this stage, but nevertheless, there's an influence there. And some of the companion documents attached to the Chemical Wedding were sometimes mirrored the Monas Hieroglyphica as well. Now, this is the part, Alex, where we can have a bit of a discussion about Harry Potter. So I hope there are some Harry Potter fans here today, because I think the Chemical Wedding has a lot of similarities with the Harry Potter series. And beyond the typical archetypal hero's journey stuff, I think there's some more specific things. Both Harry Potter takes place over 7 books. Christian Rosenkreuz's journey takes place over 7 days. Harry Potter and Christian Rosenkreuz are met with a loud, uninvited guest at the beginning of their journey, handing them an invitation. Think of Hagrid coming down on his booming motorbike. They're both given an invitation to journey to an old castle in a faraway land, which is situated on a lake filled with mermaids. The castle has moving tapestries and paintings and mischievous flying entities. Both Harry Potter and Christian Rosenkreuz are sorted down one of 4 paths. I don't think it's beyond reason to suggest that J.K. Rowling may have come across this work. And with our preliminary discussions before we started this talk, with what Alex was saying about Atlantis Bookstore, I'm now quite curious to learn about some of those discussions that may have taken place. The Chemical Wedding is a difficult text to read. In fact, if somebody came to me and said that they understood it all, at worst, I would think they're lying. At best, I think they were overconfident. It's quite complicated, and I'm not even sure whether it all does marry up harmoniously. It's quite challenging. Of it, Adam McLean, who's an eminent author and authority on alchemy, I actually came across an article of his that was written before I was born, so he's been writing for a long time. He says, its hidden mystery seems always just one step beyond our comprehension. The more we puzzle over it and appear to clear up one point, another layer of mystery arises from our new understanding of the symbolism and includes its meaning even deeper. Many esotericists despair of ever grasping its inner content, but all who work with this allegory come to respect the profound and masterly achievement of the creator of this elegantly sculpted, symbolic tale. Now, there is one other Rosicrucian writing from this period that I do want to touch upon, because again, I think it highlights quite clearly one of my main points about who the Rosicrucians were, or considered to be during the Manifesto period. These were a couple of posters which appeared in Paris in 1622. One summer morning in Paris, there were some posters put up at the major intersections, and it had that first paragraph. The next weekend, we had more posters with that second paragraph. The posters together say, "We deputies of the Principal College of the Brothers of the Rosenkreuz are making a visible and invisible sojourn in this town by the grace of the Most High, to whom the hearts of the just are turned. We shall show and teach without books or signs to speak all kinds of languages of the countries where we wish to go, to save our fellow men from the mirror of death. If he causes trouble to one of us by finding out about us for curiosity alone, he will never communicate with us. But if desire truly drives him to have his name inscribed on the register of our confraternity, we, who will judge thoughts, will make him see the truth of our promises, so that we will not need to divulge the place of our residence, since the thoughts joined to the true will of the reader shall be capable of making us known to him and him of us. In other words, good luck if you're trying to go out and find the Rosicrucians, but if you have an earnest desire in your heart, perhaps they might find you. Now, once the manifestos and the associated writings were quite profound, their message was certainly amplified by the political and social landscape at the time. And to fully appreciate why they had the impact they did, and to understand the manifestos properly, we should look at them from the perspective of 17th century Europe, particularly Germany. This was a divided Germany, political and religious schisms. The manifestos appeared several years prior to the 30-Year War. The manifestos contained quite strong anti-papal overtones. The Confessio wasn't shy at aligning the Pope with the Antichrist. So it's likely that the author or authors included Lutheran scholars. And I came across this lovely quote from Hugh Crone in his book on Paracelsus about the Reformation. He says, "I used to hold the simplistic view that the Reformation was split away from the Catholic Church by Martin Luther and his supporters, prompted by the abuses of church privileges, such as the selling of indulgences to excuse sins. Further examination shows that the Reformation was a much wider phenomenon than purely religious upheaval. Luther's formation of the 95 Theses was not the only initiator of this movement. There were at least 5 others. These were the social instability and unrest, the unsatisfactory political situation of the German lands, and the growth of a humanist outlook, to which we can add the development of printing, and lastly, money. All 5 initiators are, of course, linked. These primers detonated the slow explosion that became the Reformation in its many aspects. So it wasn't just religious unrest, it was political and social unrest as well. And if any of that sounds familiar, I think we could probably look outside and see something very similar happening in our world today. Aside from the Reformation, we also have millenarian texts circulating widely, promoting ideas of a new age, and these were very influential on the manifesto authors. One author was the 12th century mystic Joachim of Fior. Another was the Neometria by Simon Studion. And if you think the Chemical Wedding is a difficult text, the Neometria makes the Chemical Wedding look like Dr. Seuss. It's incredibly difficult, 2,000-page book of numerical prophecies. They popularized this idea of the third Elias, or Elias Artista. And we can get an impression of what Elias Artista represented at the time by looking at this quote from Paracelsus, who says, "Although then it is not so difficult a work to transmute iron into gold, God wills that the lesser operations shall be performed first, and that the greater ones should remain occult until the Elias of the art arrives." So when this Elias Artista comes along, he's going to bring along with him some secrets. He'll reveal the hidden mysteries of nature. And for those that were expectant of some new age, they would have been had their suspicions confirmed by various portents appearing in the heavens. In 1602, there was a comet that appeared in the constellation of Cygnus, the Swan. In 1603, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Pisces, which was believed by Johannes Kepler to be the same conjunction that occurred at the birth of Christ. In 1604, there was a supernova that appeared in the constellation of Serpens the Serpent. And these events were spoken about in the Confessio, where it says, "God's will has now sent as heralds the stars in the serpent and the swan, which are great signs of the great plan. They can teach how God makes these, together with human ingenuity, serve the purpose of his occult scriptures. The book of nature is opened wide before the eyes of all, though few can either read or understand it." And you can see on the image on the left here of the house of the Rosicrucians, the image of the serpent and the swan in the upper left and right-hand corners. So to summarize the landscape, we have political and social unrest brought about by the Reformation. We have a distrust in the Catholic Church. We have a heightened sense of anticipation of a new age dawning, being heralded by some saviour figure. And we have signs in the heavens confirming that all of this was taking place. And for some, the fraternity of the Rosy Cross was the embodiment of this saviour figure. So we have very intelligent people at the time writing publicly, requesting admission to this fraternity. Of course, no replies were ever made public. At this stage, we have to ask, who wrote the manifestos? At the end of the day, somebody put pen to paper. Who was responsible for fanning the flames of this movement? I'm going to propose three guys that lived at the time that we're speaking, had intimate relationships with some of the key figures around in this area, and wrote a lot about Rosicrucian philosophy. And I'm going to propose them as potential authors. The first is Michael Mayer. He was a German physician and alchemist, most known for his work at Lantifugians. But he also wrote another text called Themis Aurea, which elaborated upon the 6 laws of the fraternity. So the 6 laws were the ones in the Fama, that CR should be their seal mark and character, that they profess nothing but to heal the sick, and they do that for free, those ones. In his work, Themis Aurea, he shows a very intimate understanding of Rosicrucian philosophy. He usually uses talks about them in the third person, but occasionally he does use possessive terms. Like sometimes he'll say, it is the wish of our fraternity that humanity should be doing this, or we believe that we should be doing so and so. It almost sounds like he's letting slip something. But however, on the last page, he finally says that he's not a member. He says he was insufficient in meeting the worth of the fraternity of the Rosy Cross. There's an interesting sidebar. He also met with Heinrich Kunra and considered him to be a fraud, which is also mentioned in the Confessio. There's sort of a veiled reference to Kunra being a fraud. The next proposed author is Robert Fludd, an English physician, wrote voluminously upon Rosicrucian philosophy, alchemy, Hermeticism. I mean, he wrote everything. He was like a Renaissance person. He was like a Leonardo da Vinci. He was accused of being a member, usually by critics. Their criticism was that his own writings were so similar to the Rosicrucian writings that he must be a member. In response to one of his critics, he says, my works, and he uses very curious language here, my works are as far from the works of the fraternity of the Rosy Cross as earth is from heaven or light is from darkness. I've never seen, known, or conferred with any of the fraternity. It's very interesting language. My works are as far from the fraternity as earth is from heaven or light is from darkness. Anybody that's read any of Robert Fludd's works, if you want to talk about the light of heaven, I mean, he's holding them in pretty high esteem. He did write a couple of other texts, and in these he used a pseudonym, Joachim Frisius. These series of texts were called Summum Bonum, and in the third book of Summum Bonum, I mean, using a pseudonym does allow a bit of freedom of expression, allows you to be a bit more candid. And he says, the dwelling place of the brethren of the Rosy Cross is in the house of God, of which Christ is made the cornerstone. By their lives, they show themselves to be of the seed of God. The foundation of the house is well known. It's not built as fools imagined by alchemy or magic, but it's a divine structure. It is indeed a house not made with hands, but has its eternity from above. I hope you're starting to see a bit of a pattern here about who the Rosicrucians might be. You may need to think a bit more laterally, not think of a physical group per se. The next candidate for authorship, of course, is Johann Valentin André. He was a German theologian. He was from a strong Lutheran family. His grandfather was a signatory of some very important Lutheran document and was called the Luther of Württemberg. His family crest is a cross surrounded by roses. I mean, he's ticking all the boxes here. In his biography that he wrote at the end of his life, he claimed to have written a book called The Chemical Wedding. Now, let's be clear. He doesn't say he wrote The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. He says he wrote a book called The Chemical Wedding. Now, I've never been able to find this book. I had a hard enough time finding his autobiography. There are some Rosicrucian scholars who claim to have read it, and they say it's very different to the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. They're unrelated texts. But as a result of him writing the chemical wedding, many people have now just said, well, he's the author of the chemical wedding. And perhaps if he wrote the third manifesto, he wrote the other two as well. So a lot of people just automatically have assumed now that he is. I'm not so sure. He was also a member of a couple of potentially proto-Rosicrucian societies operating out of Tübingen University, which was a site of Lutheran scholarship. One was a fruit-bringing society, but he didn't join that until after the Rosicrucian furor had started. There was also operating from there the Order of Inseparables, which had a lot of alchemical symbolism, but we don't know whether he was a member, but he certainly had a lot of acquaintances in that group. During the course of his life, he went from being highly sympathetic to the Rosicrucian cause. Eventually, he started to voice approval of their ideals, but distance himself from the movement. And towards the end, he completely distanced himself from the buzz surrounding Rosicrucians and denounced them completely. So we've got three men there: Michael Mayer, Robert Flood, Johann Valentin Andre. Probably no greater candidates for authors than these three guys. And all of them say they weren't members. If we take their admissions as gospel, if we take their admissions as gospel and say they weren't members of the fraternity, then we have to ask ourselves, well, who in the hell was? Because there's probably not any greater candidates than these guys. Certainly there's practical reasons for denying membership. Critics of the Rosicrucian movement accuse them of heresy, of blasphemy, of necromancy. Michael Mayer in Fama Fraternitas says that many of the large apothecaries in the area were very pissed off with the Rosicrucians because at that time they had been making a killing trade, both figuratively and literally, selling very exotic pseudo-alchemical remedies. And as a result of the Rosicrucian buzz, people had stopped purchasing them. So they had been losing a bit of money. So putting your hand up as a Rosicrucian is a little bit like putting a target on your head. You may as well just go up to the Pope and say, hey, don't Giordano Bruno me, or go up to Big Pharma and say, oh, take a hike. I mean, it was pretty brave of you to admit that you're a member. But I think we should also consider something else. What does membership actually mean? It's natural for us, perhaps, to assume that membership entails paying your dues or regularly attending meetings. But I don't think this is what was meant by affiliation with the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross during the manifesto period. One thing you'll have noticed from all the quotes that I've mentioned in this presentation so far is that the manifestos, not completely, but a lot of the time, seem to be talking about a non-physical group, a spiritual group that meets in a divine temple, not built with hands, preaching about a return to a true spirituality, a transference of wisdom from east to west. What we should consider then is that the Rosicrucians represented a spiritual ideal or aspiration. In this sense, membership would entail having already achieved some illumined state of Christ consciousness, not being a member of a physical group. From this perspective, it is possible to be responsible for both the authoring of the manifestos, whilst also simultaneously, truthfully denying membership. And if you look at it from this perspective, many of the cryptic messages contained in the manifesto start to make a lot more sense, such as this one from the closing of the Fama, where it says, "And our building, even if 100,000 people had seen it from close to, shall forever remain untouched, undestroyed, unseen, and completely hidden from the godless world." So maybe we should consider that meeting with the Rosicrucians means meeting with something internal, some divine presence that was inside of us, a communion of soul, if you will. Of course, this is all a little idealistic. You're free to reject it, but I urge you to at least consider it. Nevertheless, even though we don't know about any physical groups operating from that time, eventually physical groups would arise calling themselves Rosicrucian. Now, this appendix is in my paper as well. There's a 140-year gap between the manifesto period and the first group that we know of calling themselves Rosicrucian. And this group was the Orden des Golden Rosenkreuz. Maybe Johannes can pick me up on my pronunciation at the end. The Order of the Gold and Rosy Cross. They were a Masonic alchemical society. They were established in 1756. They were highly regulated. They were German after all. They were restricted to master masons, and as time went on, this would be narrowed down further to Christian master masons of at least 30 years of age. They practiced laboratory alchemy. Practical work was essential to progress through the grades. We know a little bit about their beliefs because some of their doctrines were printed in a book known as The Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians. So we know a little bit about their philosophy and ideals. And certainly some of their values, some of their aims, such as the goal to reunite man with his original divine condition, about man being triune in nature, some of these things would have been familiar to the manifesto writers. But the more practical work, the laboratory work, would have been completely unknown, I would say, to many of the people interested in Rosicrucianism during the manifesto period. Now, there was actually a talk by somebody in this group, the Metropolitan Study Group, Ian Gladwin, that's also on YouTube, about this order specifically. So if you jump on YouTube, you can watch his video. It's definitely well worth a watch. This here is a list of all the degrees of the order with their associated signs and colours and fees and things. And this here is just that list, a little bit easier to read. I've just summarised the names of the degrees. Now, the reason I put these here is because this grade structure is still used by lots of Rosicrucian groups today. Now, there's dozens of Rosicrucian groups out there, but some of the more popular ones like AMOC and the Fellowship of the Rosicrucian and the SRIA and the Golden Dawn, they use these same grade names with some variation. SRIA uses the latter for the first grade, AMOC uses Studiosus for the first grade. I'm not too sure on how these were adopted, but otherwise we have Junioris, Theoreticus, Practicus, Philosophus, Adeptus Minor, Adeptus Major, Adeptus Exemptus, Magister, and Magus. Aside from these grade names, however, most Rosicrucian groups are quite different. For modern Rosicrucian societies, striking a balance between maintaining traditions on one hand and maintaining relevance has been quite a difficult and sometimes contentious area of work, with many contemporary groups happy to work in isolation. This has led to no shortage of Rosicrucian groups, each with their own identity, with their own traditions. For example, we have some Rosicrucian societies that have maintained that Rosicrucianism is a Christian tradition. So they only accept members of a Christian faith, such as the Fellowship of the Rosenkreuz. There are some societies that are only open to Master Masons, and by extension are only open to men, such as the Societas Rosicruciana in their various outfits. And some have removed some of the more archaic and religious terminology to try to present the core Rosicrucian principles in a contemporary fashion, such as the ancient mystical order Rosicrucians or AMOC. Therefore, a more useful exercise in discussing individual groups, because they're quite different, would be to look at what a Rosicrucian group should endeavour to be. What should they be trying to do? The initial Rosicrucian writings contained a rather holistic, albeit often inexplicit, doctrinal framework for man to know thyself and study the relationships that exist between man, nature, and God. Therefore, any Rosicrucian group worth their salt should be labouring with this work in mind. The purpose of any Rosicrucian system of study, therefore, is not to provide a student with a goodie bag of passwords and signs and gestures and traditional history, although many groups will give you these, but it's rather to use these tools and the work to assist the student to form a working relationship with their inner or divine nature, and that the inspirations that are gained from this working relationship should be put into practice for themselves, humanity, and beyond. So are we any closer now to answering the question, who are the Rosicrucians? Now, my argument throughout this presentation has been that the idea of meeting with the Rosicrucians, as spoken about during the manifesto period, represents a union between our outer or inner selves, calling that knowing thyself, union with the Holy Spirit, whatever. And that this union could be hastened by studying the book of nature and the book of God, or the microcosm and the macrocosm, or as commonly phrased in Masonic circles, by studying the hidden mysteries of nature and science. And that the revelations and inspirations that we gain from this work should be put into service of ourselves, our life, our family, our work, should be put into service of nature and our neighbourhood, and to humanity in general. If we were to look at it from this viewpoint, Christian Rosenkreuz then would embody that self-realized illumined state of being who, after having attained the philosopher's stone, assists others in realizing their own true divine state. The similarity between Christian Rosenkreuz and the life of Christ warrants reflection, and the fraternities aims to bring about a true Christianity can be and should be understood from a personal, mystical level. Certainly there was a physical side, don't get me wrong. The manifestos were not all utopian ideals. That's a lot of the stuff I've taken out is the utopian stuff. They weren't all utopian ideals. They did certainly contain historical and political notions, which, while maybe thematically similar to what we're going through today, they were especially specific to 17th century Germany. We're also meeting in physical groups, in the flesh, with our aims of our group work of knowing thyself and healing that seeming separation between us from which we have fallen is of much greater importance, and is perhaps the only reason why we still speak about Rosicrucianism today. And I'm going to leave you with one final quote from Dr. Franz Hartmann, who is pretty well respected amongst Freemasons, Theosophists, and Rosicrucian philosophers. He says, "To call a person a Rosicrucian does not make him one. Nor does the act of calling a person a Christian make him a Christ. The real Rosicrucian or Mason cannot be made. He must grow to be one by the expansion and unfoldment of the divine power within his own heart. The inattention to this truth is the cause that many churches and secret societies are far from being that which their names expressed." For anybody that's here today that wishes to learn more about Rosicrucian philosophy, I urge you to check out a Rosicrucian group to learn more. We have many people here on this talk representing many groups. They're not all the same. There is no one size fits all groups. But yeah, I urge you to check it out. It's a lovely area. And even though I've been yapping on about Rosicrucianism now for for quite a while, I'm really only scratching the surface. Yeah, look, I'm happy to take any questions or that people might have. Thank you for attending. I really hope you learned something new, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Travis, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone to say that was one beautifully enlightening, a wonderful overview. And I think it's one of those things where people start treading the path of Rosicrucianism, that they're often left on their own to piecemeal little pieces of information together and put together their own often haphazard jigsaw of the historical aspects of Rosicrucianism and what it means today, what it means for the future, what it means for the individual, all of those kind of things. And I really think that something like this, you can see the amount of work that's gone into it, but you've been able to digest it and represent it in a very understandable perspective that anybody can walk away from and go, oh my God, I've got an idea about what Rosicrucian actually is and where it fits in historically and where it can fit in today. So thank you very much for that. I think that's hugely important. I think, you know, a lot of people scratch their heads for a few years whilst they're trying to work out what this thing that's pulling them from the inside out to learn more of. So yes, that's wonderful. And I think between the balancing act of Frater Rob's discussion of 21st century Rosicrucianism and yours today, between the two of those, I think every young person, or every young person, every person who first discovers Rosicrucianism, I think between these two talks, I think there's a perfect, there you go, there's your perfect introduction to what Rosicrucian is. So thank you all very much. Everybody, what we'd like to do now is to answer questions. The best way to do it is if you can raise your hand electronically, and then I will ask for you to ask your question. So first of all, Benny, you were the first one with the hand up, so off you go, Benny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, very inspiring. And in your presentation of modern Rosicrucian orders, I actually missed the BOTA, and why I mentioned this group is that I was originally inspired by the book of the founder Paul Foster Case, the book The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, where he has a translation of two of the manifestos. And also, I think he deserves credit for his very, very profound understanding of tarots, which was not mentioned in your talk. And I think the way that he has kind of shown the very profound meaning of the symbols of especially the major arcana in tarot, I think he deserves to be mentioned here. That is my point.
Thank you, Benny. Yeah, look, there's dozens of groups out there, and you're right, I didn't mention all of them. I really only mentioned 3 of them, and I discussed the gold and the Rosicrucians in depth, but they're not existing anymore. But I only mentioned those 3, and the reason I chose those 3 was purely because, from my own experience where I live, I've met people from those 3 groups that I would say are pretty adept people. Saying that, it wasn't until I joined SRIA that I started to meet people that work with BOTA. I was familiar with the True and Invisible Rosicrucians for a while, but when I joined the SRIA, I started coming across a lot of people that have actually gone through the BOTA course and everything like that. I don't have a strong interest in tarot. Don't get me wrong, I think it's really interesting. I like all the symbolism, but I've never gone out of my way to study it as much as general Rosicrucianism. But you're right, he was certainly very influential to Rosicrucianism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan from Brazil, you're the next in the line, so please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. It was really a pleasure, and it was fantastic, Travis. I would like to kindly ask you if you may, share that slide where you showed the proposition in a chart in a table of the first order, which you told it was divided by color and degrees and things like that. If you may just share some other thoughts on that slide, I would be kindly happy. You just skip it very fast, and it made me very, very interested.
Can you see the slide there?
Yeah, that's the one. That's exactly the one. That's from the book, from that order.
No, I don't think this is from the book of that order. They didn't have any books per se. They had a lot of some of their ideas and doctrines published in the Secret Symbols. This isn't from that. I'm not too sure where this one has come from, actually. I know that there is a very good translation of this on the Pansopher's website that was done by a lady called Christine Elke, who she's got some amazing articles out there. And yeah, she did a translation of this whole table, if I recall correctly, on Pansopher's. Yeah, it goes through all the things that they learned in the degrees. We don't know everything about what the Golden Rosicrucians did. We know a little bit about some degrees. Just recently, there was a book published in English that outlined everything they did in the last degree, the final degree. And it's pretty amazing, actually. Very complicated alchemical work happening at that stage.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. You just brought me some new ideas on that item. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Carlo, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for the wonderful talk. That was very enlightening. I want to make a comment and then a question. The first thing that I want to share is this book, a Rosicrucian anthology, which you probably have seen before, compiled by Paul Allen. It's a pretty hefty tome, but it has a lot of really great, some of the original documents and a lot of great essays in here. But one thing that I wanted to throw out there is one of the introductions written by this person, Carlo Pietzner, and he seems to draw some connection between early Rosicrucian, the development of Rosicrucianism, and Karlstein Castle in Czechoslovakia, which at the time was Bohemia. So I don't know if that's a dead end or worth digging into, but I thought it was an interesting observation. And then my question is, Dame Frances Yates in The Art of Memory seems to make some connection between Rosicrucianism and the activity of Giordano Bruno and his Giordanisti, these little groups that follow Giordano Bruno. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, more from the perspective of, instead of treating Rosicrucianism as this discrete thing that we're trying to figure out, to what degree do you think it emerged out of this milieu of all these things going on, theater, Giordano Bruno, the early science, all that kind of stuff?
Well, first off, about the castle, very interesting. I haven't heard that before. I wonder if that's is an area in Czechoslovakia that was known for a lot of alchemists visiting there. There's a laneway there that now has a cafe, but it's where John Dee used to meet, and they have an annual festival there, something to do with the rose. So I wonder if it's in that same area. I'm not too sure. Regarding the art of memory and Giordano Bruno, well, I don't know a lot about the subject, and what I do know about the subject, I've garnered from the works of Frater Martin Falk. So maybe he might be the better person to answer your question there, because I'll be doing a very poor paraphrase from him.
Q stage left, Mr. Memory himself, I would say so.
Hello there. Right. So yes, there are most certainly some very suspicious connections between Giordano Bruno's ideas and those ideas and teachings that come to appear in the movement we see as Rosicrucianism. Bruno believed that the linking force, the eros, the love that we could feel towards higher things, could bring a oneness and enlightenment that could transform us. The word rose is an anagram of eros. Many of the early Rosicrucian texts have strange allusions to Bruno's ideas and works, some of them almost like reflections of books that he's written. So, for example, we have a very early work called the Kabbalah of the Firmament. This is a Rosicrucian work which is about contemplation of higher things. Bruno wrote a work called the Pegasus of the Firmament, is the Rosicrucian text. Bruno had already written a work called the Kabbalah of the Pegasus. And you can see this Rosicrucian work almost like a contemplation on his work. The Fama was released with another text called the Reformation of the Whole Wide World by the Order of Apollo and the Order of Olympus, where the gods, they try to work out ways to reform mankind, and in the end decide to give up on that and just reform themselves. Bruno had already written the Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, which is more direct. The gods there decide, oh, we're not very good images for humans, are we? We've got to sort ourselves out. And they go through and Zeus calls them all together and says, right, you're going to sort your act out, gods. Well, the buck stops here. So we can see some of the Rosicrucian texts are most certainly responding to Bruno's ideas. So I think this is a very important thing. The memory palace idea, the idea of a memory palace that can transform you and can lead to a higher state of consciousness. I think this, the Rosicrucian vault that we find, that the builder finds, I think this is certainly connected. And you can see that the formula there, perhaps not so Brunonian as Robert Flood. You know, he'd have loved that. He'd have absolutely loved that as a symbol of and as a practice. So yes, now whether they are directly linked to to Bruno's followers, I'm unsure. But what I do know is Bruno has, in his works on meditation, his works on contemplation, an idea of these knights which are qualities in your mind that you'll form to empower you and to allow you to reach higher states of consciousness, these knights of Eros. And you do see around the time people change the words around and the Knights of the Rose appear, and eventually the Knights of the Rose cross. I don't know, it's tempting, isn't it? It's tempting to say that this transmitted. What we can say is the ideas certainly did, and I think that's good. And us modern Rosicrucian practitioners, we could really learn a lot about from Bruno.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Kat, you've got your hand up next, please.
Oh, dear Travis, thank you very much. Well done. It is not my task to judge the content. I would like to share with you some impressions in connection with the tree of life. You know, the tree of life has above the ground, and Kaf is the sea. Yes, you receive from the divine by Kaf, and then you transform this what you receive by Taf. Taf is the seal of the cross, and if you have transformed that, then you can send it out by Resh, and this is the highest expression for me, how to be a Rosicrucian and how to can practice that, that you are a brother or a sister of your brothers and sisters worldwide. And someone say, you only can have an order if you yourself can be a brother or a sister to give to the others. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
You raised a
Oh, sorry,
interesting-
Travis. Sorry, do carry on, Travis. I jumped in there.
That's good. How can one be a good Rosicrucian student? There's so many societies out there. Do you pay your dues and that makes you a good member? One thing I like to, that really for me seems to be spread across all the Rosicrucian groups, is this idea that we live in a physical world and we don't deny that physical world. So there's no idea, even though we might enjoy reading about Gnosticism from its perspective of emanation and return and its Neoplatonic ideas, most people that are into Rosicrucian philosophy aren't of the opinion that the physical world is a prison or a trap, but it's the other way around. The physical world can be a way to experience and reveal the divine to us. And that seems to be spread across all Rosicrucian groups. Now, the practices, how they do it, is very different. But you can see how it could penetrate lots of practices like Rosicrucian meditation. One idea for Rosicrucian meditation, aside from all the visualization stuff that all the groups have, I mean, one simple thing would be to enter your meditation with who you are, not trying to discount all your thoughts, but you bring your thoughts and problems in with you and you work with them, because we are, after all, living in a physical world, and that's what we should be operating with. Yeah, thank you for your Kabbalistic thoughts as well. Yeah, Kat.
Hello there. I was just wondering, there's a lot of mentions of the East and wisdom coming from the East. And has anyone ever made a study of the Vedic texts, you know, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, anything Vedic in comparison to a Western Hermeticism? Because there's only been one book that I've read that sort of compares East and West mystical ideas, and that's the one that compared the Prose Edda and what's his name, Odin, and all of the Norse situations with Vedic sort of myth, and that was really interesting. But I'm wondering, why has nobody ever sort of published anything that compares Hermeticism to the Veda? Because that would surely be really interesting.
It would be really interesting. I think the simple answer to why they haven't is because it's very difficult. What we do know is that the Vedas themselves, the texts that were written in Sanskrit, are very similar to some of the texts that we find written in Avestan, very old Persian language. So we know that both the Avestan language and Sanskrit have split from some common Indo-Iranian source language. Now, we know that those people existed through the language similarities and because of the similarity of beliefs, but we don't have a great deal of much other evidence. We have some archaeological evidence. We know they used horses. We knew they grew crops. We know they had words for things like wheat and barley and horse and wheel, but we don't know a lot about their myths, not a great deal. But we know that that is what gave rise to the Indian mythology, and we know that's what gave rise to Zoroastrian mythology, and we know it gave rise to Norse mythology. It was before all of those. It gave rise to all of them, but there's not a lot of evidence to go on. We really have language similarities and myth similarities. So aside from aligning correspondences, it's a bit hard to really make a big book. Yeah, that's probably one reason that I'm thinking why. Although I see Martin has just put in a comment there, I think, with a book recommendation.
Thank you.
No problems.
Paolo, please.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation by our Frater Travis. I must congratulate you. And I would like also to share my greetings to all present. My question is about the emulation of to be Rosicrucian. Could we think on the emulation of Christ seen as born? Christ came from the other world, the absolute world, or with all the Dahat in him, and he crucified him in Malkut. And if we want to be a true Rosicrucian and not only a practitioner, should we make the transition for another crucifixions to have to enter, to open the door of the other dimensions to Bria and Absolute, and so we only could be named Rosicrucians if we could reach Dahat in Kabbalistic terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, look, certainly some people say that the life of Christian Rosenkreuz is very similar to the life of Christ. We have the Knight of the Rosecross degree in Freemasonry, and while it has a very different origin story and isn't necessarily Rosicrucian in itself, it is, I suppose, some people think of it as Rosicrucian because of its story of Christ. Yeah, sorry, but I forgot one other point that you made. It is 2:45 in the morning.
I would like to know if as Robert Flood, he said he is not, I'm not a Rosicrucian, yes, because he only could be a Rosicrucian if he grasped and could reach the other dimension, yeah, or being crucified for the other dimension as a
certainly Yes, certainly. My perspective on it is that, I mean, for simplicity in language, yes, we say we're Rosicrucians. You know, we're members of the Rosicrucian Society. We study Rosicrucian history and philosophy. Ergo, we can say we're Rosicrucians. But on another level, I'm pretty much of the opinion that we're not. I look more at Rosicrucian as an aspirational term. From my perspective, you can say we're Rosicrucian philosophers or Rosicrucian students or Rosicrucian scientists. We study Rosicrucianism, but I'd say to be a Rosicrucian is a very high ideal to strive for, and perhaps is not something that we may ever attain, but nevertheless it's something that we strive for. I suppose we can make the same argument about Freemasons. I mean, similar to that quote I put by Franz Hartmann at the end. You say that we're all Freemasons because we pay our dues, but on another level, we're not really. We try our best, but to actually fully assume the identity of Freemason, or fully assume the identity of Rosicrucian is a very, very high task. And I think that's what the people during the manifesto period were trying to say as well. That's certainly my position anyway.
Thank you so much, Travis. Thank you.
Anytime, brother. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who has a question? Brig? Normally, yay, here we go. You need to put your microphone on, Brig.
Many thanks, Travis, for a fascinating presentation. However, I am a little concerned about two things. The first thing, I want to make the observation that you mentioned the social diabolical state that Germany was in at the birth of Rosicrucianism. And yes, quite rightly, it can be argued that the whole world now on a global stage is in a similar position and in desperately in need of spiritual light. However, my question is this: if a newcomer had attended this presentation for the first time and had only just heard of Rosicrucianism, would they have found, not only in the presentation, but the resulting discussion, the question answered? So I will ask you in one sentence, who are the Rosicrucians?
In one sentence, I would say the more, got to choose my words carefully. I actually did summarize it in the paper as simply as possible. I had a lecturer, the voice of a lecturer in my ear, telling me to to summarize it. Who are the Rosicrucians?
If you are a brother and a father for your brothers and sisters, then you are a Rosicrucian.
That's one way to look at it. I think a Rosicrucian is somebody that is able to read both the universe and themselves and use the information they learn to serve themselves, humanity, and the universe. We look into ourselves, we look outside, and we use that to help others, to heal the world. And if you're doing that perfectly, you're a Rosicrucian.
Travis, that might have been a couple of sentences, but well answered. Many thanks.
Thank you, Brig.
We have a question from Rod, and it must be getting rather late over there, Rod, so please ask away.
Hi, Trav. Just
G'day,
a
Rod.
question with regard to what you just said, looking into ourselves. I'm in the process of writing a paper on knowing thyself, and I'm just wondering what role Rosicrucianism plays in understanding the self.
That's a good question, and that's one where I suppose the practical elements of Rosicrucian groups really differ in their operations and the work they do. there is no universal answer to that. There is no universal answer to say, you know, Rosicrucians look into themselves by doing this. The simple answer is reflection. But how you use that reflection, the method that you use, that is completely personal. I suppose the simple answer, though, is reflection.
Okay.
But yeah, so you're doing a paper on Know Thyself. I look forward to having a read of that at some point, Rod.
Great, thank you very much. Another question from Benny.
Hello again. It was just this talk about Western and Eastern tradition. I just wrote a short note that actually, you know, the traditions of the East and the West are not separated in the way that it appears in later European history. I think it was actually the Catholic Church which kind of interrupted this connection between East and West, you know, because there was this very large interaction. They met at the Silk Road and they exchanged spiritual ideas, you know, for a long period of time, especially during Hellenism, you know, and they knew each other's philosophies and spiritual ideas. And also an interesting thing is that alchemy is quite well known in both Western culture and also in China and India. I just read the book by Mircea Eliade, The Forge and the Crucible, which trace back, you know, the origins of alchemy. And I think it is built on very similar ideas. And I don't think there is this kind of wall between East and West. I think it's actually the same humanity.
I think, yeah, a mixture of both. So, I mean, first of all, a lot of the talk about going to the East and getting knowledge was, of course, you know, metaphorical. You know, the light of the East dispelling the darkness of ignorance, this sort of metaphor. That was the main purpose of using those words. But certainly, yeah, during different times, people actually physically traveled to get information. And they couldn't just jump online like we do now. Now, in terms of alchemy, in terms of Eastern alchemy and Western alchemy, if you can use that term, yes, they might have some similar ideas, but I think they're more outcomes rather than from sources. I think Western alchemy is pretty hardcore embedded in Hermetic philosophy. And Hermetic philosophy we can trace back to sort of Hellenistic Egypt, and we know that it was something of Egyptian origin because a lot of the Hermetic texts complain that the things don't translate well into the gross Greek language. You know, obviously somebody's not going to be writing in Greek and some Greek ideas and calling the Greek language bad. So we know that a lot of these ideas were contained in ancient Egypt, were really made written down by during Hellenistic Egypt, and it was the resurrection of a lot of those ideas that happened during the Renaissance period that we get medieval alchemy. Now, that same transfer ideas, did it happen the same way? Did Chinese alchemy manage to get some of that information via the Silk Road and express it in the same way? I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it, but from the little understanding I do have, I gather that it was actually from a different source. Not to say that the outcomes are different, because obviously we're all humans. We all, you know, we all have some special link that unites us all beyond our historical connections. But yeah, I'm not too sure whether it's
yeah, but Travis, it's a fact that the Greek actually were in India. I mean, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, you know, a lot of India was conquered, and also a lot of, for example, this Ayurvedic medicine that you know in India. Some scientists believe that it is actually a reminiscence of Greek medicine, that there were Greek doctors. And you also see in the building styles in India that there were Buddha statues made in Greek style. So they really had a connection. Also, Plotinus talked about going to India to learn about the Hindu philosophers, you know. So there was actually a connection.
Yeah, it was very common for scholarly Greek people during Hellenistic period of Egypt to travel both to Egypt and to India. There were two of the main destinations that they'd travel to get information. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much again. Was Martin, were you putting your hand up then?
So I just wanted to add the opposite was true in the sense that the gymnam sophists, as they were known at the time, like our Swami friend here, they also traveled to learn medicine in other countries. And we know that they were, at the times when the Hermetic texts were being written, they were there studying in Egypt. So the Indian traditions were coming to learn from the Western at the time. There's a lovely exchange. We even have some of the Neoplatonic students, which if you Ammonius Sechus, who Ammonius is his Greek, sorry, his Egyptian first name after Amun, and his surname is obviously an Indian one. So yeah, there's a lot of exchanging of ideas. The world isn't as separate as it seems from a historical perspective.
Yes, there's I can't remember which tomb it is in Egypt. I can't remember which Ramses it is, but if you look onto the ceiling, there's a wonderful depiction of wise men who obviously had come from the East. They look very Eastern in their facial structure and the way that their clothing is. So you can to have that on the ceiling of an ancient Egyptian tomb means that, you know, that the pre-Hellenistic period of Egypt. I've always read when it says they went to the East, I've always considered that a sort of a metaphysical term for Egypt, because so much of all of this stuff comes from Egypt. It then goes to the sort of the Hellenistic period in Egypt, when you think about how the Greeks were in awe and honored the religion of the Egyptians and the knowledge of the Egyptians, and then how that all just flowered out. So I've always, more so I think the modern perception of the East being Asia, I think that's because our notion of travel is so much greater than our ancient cousins, that I've always thought that the East was a nice little term that actually meant the ancient knowledge of Egypt. Well,
sorry to I've got to add this. Yeah, so the trope of the East as a form of enlightenment, especially at a time where organized Freemasonry was increasing, is a common one, and it was actually a Christian trope. So journeying to the East, or looking to the East, or sons of the East, it was the idea that you could look below that, through the horizon, see where the light came from, to see the underlying stuff. And so that's a very interesting time. If you were a man in the 18th century, or a person who's well educated in the 18th century, and you heard someone talk about going to the East or advancing to the East, you'd know he was talking about find out the underlying principles. I just wanted to sort of add that's something they'd see that as. Incidentally, as an aside, in the Hermetica, we're told that if we want to visit India, we just have to imagine ourselves there. And it will be there. It's in the same section when we're told we can, do anything with the power of the imagination. But it's interesting that the Hermeticists were telling us to dream of India.
Anyway, if I may, it's just fun to point out. Sorry, but it goes the other way as well. So, for example, you'll see some references through Gnostic texts of Persians heading to Egypt as though that was the land of darkness that they had to go and endure and slay a terrible serpent and return from. Or if you go a bit further east to China, then you go journeying to the west for enlightenment. So
it's the journey that's important.
Yes, not the destination. Anybody else before we wrap up what has been an absolutely fantastic afternoon? Anyone for a last question? No? Well, thank you, Travis, very much for what has been an absolutely wonderful presentation, an absolutely wonderful afternoon of enthusiastic discourse, and just another example to say that the MSG is a really wonderful. Oh, hold on! I was at a clap. That's a clap from Carla, not a hand being raised. So once again, thank you. Hopefully see you all next month for our last meeting of the year. And again, to Travis, to all of our Australian fratres who it must be getting on to 2:30 in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, something absolutely ridiculous. So thank you all again, and we shall see you next month, hopefully. Take care, everybody.